good afternoon, everyone. So as Emma's already introduced me, I'm Richard Saunders. I'm the Contensis product owner, and it's my responsibility to determine how Contensis moves forward and how we plan our roadmap, along with the Chief Product Officer, Simon, who's joining on the call today. He's the one in the red hoodie. And yeah, we're around and we're available for any kind of questions in the end. So just to give you a little bit of an update, this year we've released Contensis 12, and 2 weeks ago we released Contensis 12.1. Today's webinar is going to touch on the features that were released as part of 12.1. If you're in attendance in Velocity, we went over a number of features that were part of Contensis 12, particularly around site view. And I'm happy to kind of take any questions about that as well at the end, if there is anything that you haven't caught up on through the blog, through the documentation, and through Slack. So thought we'll give you a bit of a snapshot and an overview of what we'll cover today in today's webinar. There are kind of three main sets of features. There's the tabbed editing interface, so creating and managing tabs in content types and entries, and also looking at inline asset publishing. This the same as images are currently published inline, and a bunch of improvements that we've made around the content type builder and the entry editing experience as well. And then we'll wrap up the end of this update with a Q&A through your questions through the chat panel. So for those of you who are just joining us, there's a chat function, and through there you can ask any questions that you might have as you're seeing things as we go along, questions that you might have already before you've joined, and anything that crops up during the Q&A session. So without further ado, let's talk about tabbed editing. So since Contensis 9, we've been really promoting the use of content types, and content types are a structured way of bringing content together in a reusable form, so fields of content that can be reusable. Now, throughout that time, content types have become bigger. People have found more uses for the use of content types, and as they've kind of expanded their web presence or their use of content types and entries, these content types have become bigger and harder to manage sometimes from an author experience. As you can see from this kind of animated GIF, now this is a course at a university, and there are a lot of fields in that course content type. And so for an author experience, populating this content type can be quite a laborious process. So we've introduced the idea of tabs to do this. And part of that is coming into the content type builder and actually beginning to shape that content inside the content type, and breaking that content type down further into organized groups. So I think the best way to kind of go through some of this is to actually look at a demonstration. So I'm going to spend most of the time today in Contensis actually showing you these features. You'll get a bit of a clearer view of these rather than me just talking about it without seeing the screens themselves. So let me head over to CMS. So for those of you using content types and entries, the entries screen will be very familiar to you, and the entries are listing out all the content based on the content types that have been defined in the system. In this scenario, I've created a set of content types based on stories and books and characters. My childhood interest in Roald Dahl always comes out in these kind of examples, and I've begun to break down what it looks like. What is a story? What is a book? Who's it made up of? And what are all the kind of associated parts? So if we head over to the entries again and we look at something like a story like Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, what we end up with is an entry form that gets populated about that story. And here we've got title, synopsis, a bit of a background about the book, maybe an image that might be used to display on a particular story page on a website or an application, when the book was first published, who might have wrote the book, and what characters are in the book. So a whole bunch of fields that represent a particular story. And from that, you might begin to connect that story with a series of publications or products. So in this scenario, I've got Charlie and Chocolate Factory could potentially come in the form of an audiobook or a printed publication. Printed publications obviously come in hardback, paperback, multiple editions, all of which are individual pieces of content and may want to be managed independently, and the same with audiobooks. But actually this form itself is beginning to appear quite long, similarly to what we saw in that animated GIF right at the beginning. The course content type was really long because it contained lots of fields. And this is just the outset of me creating a story. Over time, we might find additional information that we want to include as part of a story. And that authoring experience is only going to become more difficult. So what we can do is we can begin to look at the content type of a story, and we can begin to break and group down some of these fields. So I'm going to show you how to do that. If you're a content type administrator in the system, you can, from the More Actions column, you can edit the content type from here directly. That was a feature that was introduced in 12. But if you can also go to the content type screen and edit the story from there as well. So if we go into the content type at the moment, here we are in the content type builder, and we're looking at a representation of those fields that we saw in the entry editor. And they're in a kind of long linear list. Now, prior to Contensis 12.1, each of these fields had a series of buttons placed on the right-hand side, which would aid you ordering them and aiding the order of what an author would see. As part of the UX experience, we've introduced kind of drag and drop ordering to these, making it easier for when you've got those long content types. And that's really down to the fact that when we introduced tabs, it seemed like a sensible time to bring those improvements to it. So, as I mentioned earlier, a story could have a series of products. So in this case, audiobooks and books. So I'm going to start off by creating a new tab to group that content and call it products. So add a new tab, give it a name. That tab is produced and is added next to overview. And now I can be in this content type, and I can move these books and product types in two different ways. I can drag and drop. So I can drag and drop audiobooks into products, and it tells me it's been moved to the product section. Or if you want to stay here as well, you can just move to tab from the context menu. And if you're used to using the keyboard and you've navigated to the list of items, pressing the tab key, you can open up the More Actions button and do this with kind of keyboard behavior as well. So let's hit on products. So products has now, the books have now been added to the products tab. And if I just save those changes, and from this context menu again, if you have got permission to create an entry of the story type, I create a new entry now. What you'll see is these tabs now have been introduced into the editor, just making it easier to kind of break down that content. Let's head back over to the content type builder and just look, is there any other information that could potentially be moved over into their separate tabs? I think in Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, there were 4 or 5 characters listed in the original entry. And characters is something you'd probably update once or just occasionally add to. So you probably wouldn't want it in the flow of your kind of main overview tab. So we'll just create another one, another tab called characters, like so. And just move this characters field over. And again, if you want to change the order of these tabs, you can move them one place to the left or to the right. If you want it at the beginning, you can move it directly to the beginning or to the end. So you kind of got the kind of flexibility you need to kind of rearrange the order that these things are displayed. And as we showed at the beginning, like a course content type might have in a university, might have 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 different tab types. And there's probably a natural flow in the way that you would an author would populate that content. So working with your content authors, it's important that these content types are shaped with your authors and getting the feedback from your authors about making that experience really kind of straightforward for them. So let's save that, and this time, rather than go into an empty entry, let's go and see an existing entry that I've created. So go back to Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, and now you can see that the characters tab is there, and we've got Charlie Bucket, Willy Wonka, the Oompa Loompas, and Grandpa Joe, who are all the main characters there. And inline entry editing still works in the same way from tabs, so you can open up Charlie Bucket and edit that as a character, and each subsequent content type can have their own tabs as well. And I think one of the good ones to look at would be an author. So let's go and look at people. An author is a person at the end of the day, so let's go to content types, edit a person, and here's another example. People, a person will have some key information that's only ever entered once. And so actually having content in a tab that is really going to be kind of populated is a great place to use tabs. So in this content type, we've got information around the date of birth, their place of birth, their date of death, and the place of death. So in Roald Dahl's situation, who's the writer of the Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, we know he's passed on, so we can just do birth and death, add that tab in, and then move those fields. So move to tab birth and death, move to tab birth and death, and these will all get added in the order in which I'm adding them, so they'll all be added to the bottom of the list. And so they're in place now. So when I come to edit Roald Dahl in the entry editor, so just filter to people, person, Roald Dahl. When I edit him now, we'll see his birth was in Llandaff in Cardiff, and he passed away in Miserdon, I think it is, in Oxford. So that information is only ever going to be edited once, so there's no point including that information maybe in the main field that you might be populating on a regular basis. So that's creating tabs and moving fields to tabs, the ability to move content between tabs. And if you want to delete the tabs as well, that's again straightforward. So I'll edit this content type again. And if I wanted to get rid of the birth death tab, I can simply go delete, and it's saying where do I want to move the fields that are currently there. So I can move all those back to the original tab, and here they all are and included. So really easy to create and manage tabs using the content type builder, making it easier for your authors to populate content and for you to arrange that content in a natural flow for them in that kind of authoring process. So that's tabbed editing. Next thing that's probably worth talking about is inline publishing. And my slide deck refreshed. So yeah, inline publishing. So when we introduced content types and entries and the ability to upload assets and images within a content type, what you were finding is that we would upload an image, we would save that image, and when you publish the entry, we would automatically publish the image along with the entry itself. And this mimics the behavior in Contensis Classic. So when you created a web page and you dragged an image into a WYSIWYG area and that page got approved and published, the image would have got approved and published alongside it. However, if you dragged and dropped a PDF document that hadn't yet been approved and published, and you published the web page, we wouldn't approve the PDF document alongside the web page. And this is because you'd want to potentially review that content before it got approved. But since we've moved to the content types and entries model and introduced roles and permissioning, what you are finding is that actually, if you've given someone permission to update an entry around a very strict set of fields, say, for example, the book that we were just looking at or the story we were just looking at, you're saying to that person, I'm allowing somebody to create a book and the associated content to go alongside it. So approving the image alongside the entry makes sense. Whereas you should probably have done the same thing with assets in that instance. So in an audio book, maybe you have a sample of the audio. And today, what would actually happen is if you added an MP3 file to an entry and we published the entry, that asset would remain in Contensis Classic waiting to be approved, waiting for someone to go along, look at the content, approve it before it would display on your front end site. So what we've done in Contensis 12.1 is follow the same principles as we have in image publishing and introduced inline asset publishing. So to give you a little overview of what that looks like, let's go down the entries route again, and we'll take a look in this scenario, an audiobook. So a particular product of a story. We'll go back to kind of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. And here we've got a really simple content type containing 4 fields. What's the title of the product? What's its cover artwork? Who narrated this audiobook? And a sample file. So before we get on to the asset uploading, I wanted to just show you in the toolbar here now on the right hand side, what you'll see is there's a field marker saying that there are 2 errors. And when we introduced the idea of tabs, we needed a way to summarize maybe publishing errors that were going to occur and validation errors that were going to occur when you hit the publish button. And when you've got things in sort of 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 tabs across the screen, we need a way of summarizing that information for you to easily work through particular errors. So in this scenario, cover artwork is missing. So I wouldn't be able to publish this audiobook without populating the cover artwork. And it also needs a narrator. So if I click on narrator, if I had a long content type, it would scroll to that field. So the narrator field needs populating. So I know I've already got one. It's Douglas Hodge that's narrated Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. Let's just upload an image. So if I go to my desktop and go to this audio book, here we go. Charlie and the Chocolate Factory's cover artwork. And you see, as I corrected those issues, the validation errors disappeared as well. So it gives you some clarity around that. And now I'm going to upload an MP3 file. So get back over to my desktop, upload Charlie and the Chocolate Factory audio file. And now you can see here in the right-hand side, the cover artwork is needing to be published. The MP3 file is obviously got published. Here it is, it's needing to be published as well. It's recognized that this file here, the audio file, needs publishing as well. So at this point in time, when I hit the publish button, what's actually going to happen is this image artwork will get published alongside the entry, which was the same behavior as it was prior to 12.1. We're just indicating now that this image will be published along with it. And we will also publish the MP3 file that you've just uploaded, negating the need for anyone to kind of go back into the approval screen to deal with that, and not having this issue on front-end websites where maybe the entry or the audiobook is published and the sample not being available. So When I publish this entry now, those two files will go through the publishing queue and they will get published. So let's just take a look at the files in the File Explorer. So you can see that the audio, I've created an upload path for these audio covers. So if I go to the audio book and I go to information, it says its status is now published. And if I go to the audio file sample, I go to this information, that item will be published as well. So let's just take a look. So they should have gone through the classic publishing queue. Let me go here. So there's no items in the queue, so they're live. And when I go back into the entry, what we should see is go to the audiobook. And now here in this panel, there are no unpublished assets because they got published in line with that entry. So now both the audio file and that image file are available on the front end website. Prior to this feature in 12.1, the author would have had to come up to the items awaiting approval screen and approve that content for it to go out. So that streamlines if you've been moving away from producing classic web page content, you've been working towards creating content types and entries, you're going to see a reduction on the friction that you were having previously by this process. Couple of things to note: if you have got a content type that has the basic approval the basic workflow, so the item can be published automatically, that will work the same as an entry. The items will be displayed, and when you hit publish, everything gets published along with it. If you're in the approval workflow and you've got an approver to look at that content, they would see the split screen view as usual, the panel displayed with the items that are going to be approved as part of that process. And there was an option in the inline assets panel with a download button, so you could preview that content, so you could download a PDF or download that audio file just to verify what is going to be approved is a valid approval. And if it wasn't, you could just decline that entry as you would normally and inform the author that they needed to replace the audio file or the PDF that was attached. So that follows the kind of same practices as the entry approval workflow. So that's inline publishing, which I've given you your demo of. And let's touch on a few other things. There are a few other sort of improvements we've made around content types and entries and UX improvements, particularly around kind of copying content. So I think a really good example, actually, let's switch over to this courses content type and give you an example. So right at the beginning of the webinar, I showed that animation of a course that was that had many fields. So let's look at this undergraduate course here. So you can see here there's a course with many fields populated, and go back, I've created one without the tabs, so this is the original one. So here it is without the tabs. So many fields. Got a bunch of fields here that are being in where data has been imported from a third-party system that might have contained university course information. So those fields are marked as read-only and they're never going to be editable by an author. And as you can see, this is quite a complex one to deal with. Now, you might find that you've got a postgraduate course that basically has the same fields but has some additional fields than this one. So now in 12.1, you can copy an entire content type. So you can just do a copy here. And we've created a new copy. So I'm going to call this postgrad. Postgrad. Screen sharing's things a bit slow. So go to postgrad and publish that one now. So I've got an exact replica of that previous content type now with all its field, with all the field validation that you've kind of specified without needing to manually recreate this or without having to go into the JSON view to copy and paste the field content over into another content type. So the way you do it prior to 12.1 would be to copy this field's information, go to content types, go to new content type, give it a name, create. Oh, I've done one the same. Tell you what, let's go. Here's my postgraduate course. Refresh this a minute. I'm using the development branch of Contensis at the moment, internal version. So let's go to postgrad. Cool. So yeah, that's copying a content type. So if I go over to components, you can also do create a copy of a component. So I've lost my train of thought. So if I go to a module component now, I can also do a copy of a component. And that gets copied, so no manual recreation of existing components. And we can do the same behavior in roles as well. So head over to the role screen. Now, roles are something that can have quite a lot of complexity to them, depending on how you've got them configured for your system. So let's do a new role and call this product managers. And a product manager might have permission to create the wrong project. Let's not call it product managers. Let's give it a new name. Let's call it postgrad courses. Okay, so postgraduate courses, postgraduate content type, and they can create, update, approve, and publish and unpublish postgraduate courses. And maybe they can also add modules, so they can publish and create all modules. And then you might assign a bunch of users and groups to this. Probably haven't got any realistic product managers group here. Oh, I haven't added a language. Let's head over to languages, add the language for that content type, add the language for that content type, and save. So, and if I added a series of asset permissions as well, and I wanted to copy this entire role, well, now I can copy an entire role that's been set up from a security group's perspective and all the individual permissions, and just rename this role something else. So undergrad, and change postgraduate to undergraduate, and hit save. So I've got set up the same permissions for a different set of content types, and I could alter the users and groups particularly for this setup. So remove product managers in this case. So easy ways to copy content types, copy components, and copy roles and permissions. The other thing that's worth looking at is in the content type builder, we know that sometimes you've created a series of fields. So let's go back over to my books content type. Let's go to content types, and let's look at a book. So in a book, I might want to write a kind of short summary or a description about the book and use a composer field, for example. So if I get a composer and call this what's the book about, overview, maybe call this book overview. And then normally in a composer you would construct it with a series of fields. So you might include a text field, you might include a quote field from maybe the book, quote, and you might include an image in that composer field. And that's great. You've got this kind of field that you've started shaping, but then you realize you need another field that's very, very similar. And up till now, you'd have to go into the JSON view, copy all the settings for these fields and duplicate it. But now you can simply click on the context menu and duplicate the field, and you get an exact replica of the previous field and the ability to overwrite it. So new field, and there we got a composer field that is identical in setup with a new field name. And this one might include additional editors. So you might have an entry picker or some other field attached to it. And this is available for all field types as well. Oh, I haven't added the content type. Let's just add a language. So yeah, you can duplicate a publish date. So let's duplicate that one and call this one first publish date. So really easy to duplicate fields now. We've also introduced a series of copy to clipboard functions. So I know from developers, they've asked the ability to easily copy things like API names for content types, for field IDs, and these can be copied and pasted now directly off the fields themselves. And we've also introduced it into the API keys screen where the values are quite long. So client IDs and shared secrets both have the copy to clipboard function, so it makes that a lot easier to bring over. So those are the series of improvements, UX improvements we've made to the screen. So in summary, we have now created and managed tabs to improve the content creation workflow. I demonstrated the drag and drop and the ability to reorder the fields in tabs and composers. Showed the validation panel of errors that may be present within an entry over multiple tabs. Showed how assets can now be published in line with an entry, and so reducing the friction between class going up to the classic approval screen. The inline publishing panel highlighting which new assets haven't been published yet. Showed how to make copies of content types, roles and components, duplicating fields, and those copy to clipboard functions. So that summarizes the updates for 12.1.